My enormous pleasure. Recording in progress, got it. My great pleasure to welcome Beth Greenhough to speak to us today. Beth and I kind of met each other while working on a giant $24 million grant that went absolutely nowhere, but was still a very fun process. And Beth is an associate professor of geography, human geography at the University of Oxford, and she's a fellow at Keble College. And her research examines the social implications of scientific innovations, especially in health, biomedicine, and the environment. And currently, she's working on this very large project called the Animal Research Nexus, in which her part is to understand how social relations affect animal research and can generate cultures of communication and cultures of care within that. So she's really interested in sort of everyday ethics and how people really care for themselves and each other when doing what can be quite challenging work. We're really going to hear about human welfare today. And then on that topic, I'll just remind everyone what we know already, which is that Canada's history of colonization orchestrated the displacement of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from their ancestral lands, and that the University of Guelph resides on the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I acknowledge that with thanks and gratitude. And without further ado, over to you, Beth.
Brilliant. Well, I'll begin by saying thank you so much to Georgia and to all for the invitation to talk to you today, and to Quinn for all her help with the organisation. All the help with the organisation is fantastic. Thank you. So I've been asked to talk about our ongoing work around the culture of care in animal research. And what I'd like to do with this talk is offer some insights into the kinds of qualitative research we do and how we try and understand the social relations and cultures that shape animal research, mostly focusing on the UK. I want to reflect on some of our research findings, and I want to think about how we're using those findings to try and have an impact beyond academia by working with stakeholders to develop some new training resources for use in animal research facilities. So sort of from methods to findings to impact is the journey I want to try and map today. So broadly, this is a talk in 4 parts. I want to give you a little bit of background into the rise of the culture of care in the UK and how that term's sort of used in the communities I work in. A little bit more background into some of the methods we use. So for those of you who aren't so familiar with qualitative methods, the things we do to try and understand social relations and cultures. I'll share a few of our findings, particularly those that relate to this idea of a culture of care and ethics and practice. And then in the final section, I'll reflect on, again, how we're using this to work with stakeholders to try and develop this new culture of care training resource. Okay, so without further ado, what is the culture of care in the UK? Well, we can probably trace here in the UK the origins of the term to a series of scandals in the human healthcare sector, in particular investigations into malpractice at places like the NHS Mid Staffordshire Health Trust, and how these drew attention to a seemingly uncaring workplace culture, and it created a sort of social unease around what we might call cold forms of care in institutional settings. To put this simply, there seemed to be a disconnect between the physical labour of caring for, so providing food, water, pain relief, etc., and the more intangible aspects of caring about, so being responsible for, taking an interest in, empathising with. And this led to a series of interventions that were designed to promote a culture of care within institutions, things like the NHS Culture of Care Barometer, so we're trying to capture and measure some of these more intangible aspects of care. And this pattern from human healthcare was also echoed in the animal research sector. Again, there were a series of scandals, infiltrations by the British Union for the abolition of vivisection, for example, into Imperial College London, which again, the response was a concern for developing this culture of care, alongside a long-standing commitment to 3 R's of reduction, refinement and replacement of animal use. But some would even date this much earlier to an infiltration of Huntington Life Sciences in 1997, where again there was a real concern with the fact that even though husbandry was being performed, there wasn't a culture of caring for and about the animals within the institution. There was a significant overhaul of training procedures and staff and things like that. Alongside this, there's also been a growing recognition in both internal assessments and external assessments of animal research cultures of the emotional labour involved. So the idea that to work in this kind of sector, you somehow have to hide your feelings in order to look professional. And around issues of compassion fatigue. So the idea people have a diminished capacity to empathise with the humans and animals they're working with due to sheer emotional and physical exhaustion. And this is captured in the work of people like Burke, Luke and Michael, Keith Davies here in the UK, Leslie Sharp in the US, Newsom and so on. So it's both an interest for people working in the sector, but also for academics working on this topic more broadly. So what is this thing called? There we go. What is this thing called a culture of care? Well, I'd say today it's something that's widely recognised in the UK and internationally. I was listening to a presentation in Latin America on the culture of care earlier today, so definitely internationally now. And it's seen as being key to the welfare of both staff and animals in animal research facilities and to the quality of science produced. So in the same way good animal welfare is key to good science, good welfare for staff and humans is also key to good science. Significantly, then, what distinguishes maybe the culture of care from something like the 3 R's of animal welfare is this emphasis on both humans and animals. So it has also a care for staff, it has a care for institutional structures, practices, objectives. And I found this definition from Sally Robinson and colleagues really, really useful. They say that a culture of care goes beyond adhering to legal requirements. So it's not just complying with regulation. It supports an organisational culture, values of being caring and respectful towards animals and co-workers. It's the responsibility of everybody. So there's key ideas about both shared and individual responsibility captured here. It should instill responsibility and accountability in those planning and implementing research. And so they can do the right thing ethically and strive for continuous improvement. So there's some really important ideas there about how it's for people and animals, how it goes beyond just complying with regulation, and how it's about taking and sharing responsibility. I did a brief analysis of some of the publications around culture of care. And these are some of the key themes I saw emerging. So these are all the different elements that are captured in some of these publications around a culture of care. And you'll see it goes all the way up to sort of institutional leadership and structures. So they talk about the need for strong management commitment to a culture of care. They talk about a shared institutional culture, a shared set of values, a shared vision of a culture of care, if you like. A commitment to animal care and welfare and to staff care and welfare. This idea of shared responsibility. There's an emphasis on training in some of these programs. So the idea that there's an effective operational structure with clear roles and responsibilities. There's good provision of training. There's an emphasis on rewarding good practice. So when you have a good culture of care, you need to recognise, promote and reward this, something that people are praised for doing. Empowering staff, giving people the ability to speak up when they're concerned, and also empowering those committees that are responsible for overseeing animal welfare. And then the final two, good communication, which has become really important in some of the work I've been doing. And also a commitment to take a culture of care into account when who you choose to work with outside an organisation becomes an issue. So it's not just about your own institutional culture, but how you make decisions about who you want to work with. Is their culture of care one that aligns with your own values? So there's a sort of growing series of statements and publications which try to, and I've sort of listed all the references on the bottom there, I can share those later, but it kind of sort of reflects a growing list of benchmarks about how we identify this thing called a good culture of care. So how do I fit into this picture? Well, I'm part of, as Georgia mentioned, this group called the Animal Research Nexus. And this is a big program of research funded by the Wellcome Trust that's interested in researching the people who do animal research, if you like. We're interested in the social relations and cultures that emerge around animal research. But we're also committed to putting that research to use to try and generate new cultures of communication. So to try and get all the different stakeholders we work with to talk to each other in new ways and around difficult subjects. The tools we use to do this are those of the social sciences and humanities. So we spend time interviewing people, we spend time doing participant observation or effectively work shadowing people in their day-to-day work. Some of my colleagues look at archives, others engage in art and performance activities. And all this work is focused on trying to understand the social dynamics of the animal research community. And as I said, to try and generate these new cultures of communication. And we hope this is the way we contribute to generating better welfare for both humans and animals. And this is where I think our work really connects with the culture of care. On a more day-to-day basis, for me and my team specifically, we're social scientists. So we work mainly with interviews and participant observation. And it means we spend a lot of time listening to stories told by people from across the sector, working at all levels, from researchers and PIs through to animal technicians, vets, NGOs and other stakeholders, hearing about their experiences of working in animal research. And we then try and take a systematic overview of these and look at some of the themes, common themes, concerns and issues that they hold together. I'll just take a few moments to explain a little bit more about what I mean by these methods. So first of all, it means we have a particular style of asking research questions. So qualitative methods are better at answering some kinds of questions than others. And a lot of our questions are concerned with the way people perceive things, how they experience things, and how they understand the world around them. So I've just pulled out 3 of the questions from some recent projects. Our sort of first work on animal research was with my colleague Emma Rowe, and we really focused on junior animal technologists. And we had a set of questions about how they came to terms, not in terms of broad ethical principles, what do you believe in, but how they negotiated day to day some of the ethical challenges of their work and how they thought about what the right thing to do in particular situations was. As part of the animal research Nexus, we've asked questions about new species and spaces. So what happens in an animal research setting when you change the place you do research, when you take research maybe out of the laboratory and into the field? How do your ethics, values, practices translate or not when you're not working in laboratory context? Or new species. So if we've got a good understanding of what care looks like for, say, laboratory mice, how does that change when you're working with fish? So how do some of those personal experiences of giving care, receiving care, understanding care change with different species? And then finally, we don't always derive our own research questions. We also work collaboratively with stakeholders to understand the questions that are important to them. And so the final question I've listed on screen came from a collaborative agenda setting exercise where we work with stakeholders. And interestingly, a whole set of the questions they came back with, they thought we could help with, were all around a culture of care. How can a culture of care be defined? What does it look like when it's functioning well? This is a great question because everyone says they know when they see a good culture of care, but they can't explain to me how they know it. And that's the kind of thing we think is really interesting to explore as a social scientist. And what factors enable or constrain its development? So what things get in the way of people putting a culture of care into practice? Okay, so some of our key methods: participant observation. So when I started out this project and working on animal research, I'd never been in an animal research facility. So some of the work that Emma and I did really early on was what we call participant observation. So we went into settings and we spent time hanging out with people working in these settings. We looked at what they did day to day. We talked about them, what they did day to day. We also actively participated in it. We really tried to get a feel for what work feels like. So on the screen, I've shared a quote from my fieldwork diary. So participant observation is always like having 2 jobs because you spend the day doing the day job you're observing and then the evening writing a really, really detailed diary of everything you did and thought about that day. I always tell students it's really exhausting. But this is an extract from one of my diaries where I'm writing about what it was like to be in the shoes of an animal technologist, in this case, changing water bottles on cages, and the kind of things it led me to notice. So it really draws your attention to a lot of the skill involved in that work, the kind of things people might do instinctively, the things they know to check for. It also lets you feel what that work is like, how exhausting it can be. So the physical labor of lifting cages in and out of racks in an animal research facility is something that I think you wouldn't pick up if you just sat down and interviewed someone. You kind of have to be there and experience it. What a place smells like, what it feels like to work in there. And this really helped us understand and familiarize ourselves with the kind of experiences of people we'd later talk to in interviews. So I talk about how sometimes the work's really repetitive and I lost track of what I was doing and I almost forgot I was working with mice, and then this little nose would peek out and I'd kind of realize that the animals were there again. So it's these kind of things that sensitize you to. We also then follow this up with what we call in-depth interviews. And interviews, again, are a particular technique. They involve sacrificing, I think, breadth for depth. So interviews can't necessarily give you a representative sort of perspective of what every animal technologist in the UK experiences. But what they can do, again, is sensitize you to some of the stories behind people's particular views or experiences. So, for example, if I did a broad survey and said to people, why did you get into animal technology? They'd probably say, because I love animals. That's a common reason I'm given. I really wanted to work with animals. What I got from interviewing people and sort of spending a bit of time getting them to elaborate on that was a whole story about how they had a series of experiences of working with animals across lots of different settings. So I should add, all the names are changed. So we always use pseudonyms for people. So Eleanor, not her real name, talks about how she worked in a kennels as a dog walker, how she then went on to work in an exotic pet farm and running pony rides. And what was really interesting about some of these origin stories of animal technologists is how they compared their capacity to give care to animals in different settings. So often they'd say, actually, I like working in animal technology better than in a pet shop because I have more control over animal care and welfare than I did when I was working in some of these other settings. So it's that kind of depth of story you can get out of interviews. And we did repeat interviews. So we talked to people 3 times over their first 2 years in the job. And so you also get sensitized to how ideas of care, understandings of animals change over time as you spend time working in a particular position. So I think interviews are useful for getting at some of that depth. And it also then raises issues that you might pursue with a wider scale quantitative study. So interviews, I say, often give me a really good idea of what I'd want to ask in a survey if I wanted to kind of scale up and do one. Interviews are often quite long, so they can be 1 to 2 hours. So you spend a lot of time with people and you build a rapport with them. And then we transcribe them. So we, or luckily when you're more senior, you can pay someone else to do it, then would write this out in full. And we systematically analyze our fieldwork diaries and interviews. So what we do then is take all these conversations, all our diary notes, and we code them. So we look for themes and ideas that emerge across the different people we've worked with or the different places we've worked. You probably can't read the names on screen. This image is derived from a program called NVivo, which we use to code qualitative data. And we label different sections of transcripts with this person's talking about ideas of ethics, or this person's talking about experiences of care, or this person's talking about barriers to putting care into practice. And we get a kind of thematic overview of things people talk about a lot. And this is how we pull out, identify key issues and shared concerns. So the bigger the box, broadly speaking, the more people talked about it or the more time was spent talking about it. It's called a sort of hierarchy map. And this flags some of the themes we might want to focus on in our research. Okay, so very whistle-stop tour there of qualitative methods. But what using these methods across the UK animal sector allowed us to do was track the emergence of cultures of care as a concept. We began this work in 2013. And at the time, a lot of the particularly more junior staff members we spoke to had never even heard of the term culture of care. But over the past 8 years, we've seen it go from being something that only maybe senior management made reference to something that's been much more widely expected. We also kind of pick up on how people have very different understandings of culture of care. So if you raise a question of culture of care in an interview, people will give you very different understandings of what that means. So for example, for a lot of the junior technologists, it was more about animal welfare. Senior staff had a much more sort of holistic understanding of what a culture of care was. So there's some interesting themes and questions emerging there. So what I'm going to do next in my findings section is share some quotes from interview material with you. They're kind of representative of some of the broader themes, so things a lot of people spoke about or were concerned about. It doesn't imply everybody working in animal research at these levels feels this way, but it does mean similar sentiments were expressed across a significant number of our participants. Okay, so here's some of our findings. The first one, perhaps unsurprisingly, was that the culture of care can mean very different things to different people. In our research, as I was saying, more senior technicians and managers spoke of this in terms of things like professional standards, clean and tidy workplaces, people sort of being smart and knowing what they were doing. And it talked about embedding this within a workplace ethic that insists on very, very high standards, or a strong sense, as one manager put it, of how we do things around here. There's also a real emphasis on compliance with regulation. So there's a real kind of fit with legislation there. When we went into the animal facility and talked to the animal technologists or the animal care staff, though, the phrase culture of care captured something very different to them. and it was about a shared disposition to care for animals. And so they talked about how it was not just one person who cares, but for them, a culture of care was expressed in the way people related to animals. So this kind of picked up for us, there's lots of different definitions. So everyone might agree there's a good culture of care, but they might be thinking very different things when they agree to that statement. A second sort of key finding was around communication, as I flagged earlier. So making sure everyone involved in the animal use, care and welfare feels able to share their concerns and experiences emerged as an ongoing challenge for especially junior staff. So here's Carrie on screen talking about some of her experiences. And she says, there are certain things that you see and want to change. And at the minute, it's kind of like, I don't want to step on anyone's feet. And she's articulating quite a common sentiment about feeling concerned on something, but don't know when it's legitimate to raise that as a concern. I find it quite challenging, she says, to know where the lines is. And it's really interesting to see this sense of being unable to speak or not qualified to speak reflected in sort of broader ways. So at a recent Animal Technology Congress here in the UK, Penny Hawkins and colleagues were interested in whether animal technologists wanted to join their local ethical review board. And they found that, well, 82% of participants, these sort of animal technologists, would like to be on the ethical review board. Only about 34% acted on that. And that, again, reflects this idea of not feeling able to speak, to articulate. Therefore, we can say that it's not just rules and regulations, maybe, that define a practice of care, but also institutional environments and cultures, the culture that gives people the feeling they can speak up or not. In practical terms, this leads to the imperative that we need to do more to address this sense of powerless, maybe amongst junior staff, and so they feel more empowered to speak up. Thirdly, we can think about how institutional and workplace cultures can create obstacles to delivering good care. So sources of pressure can vary between the different sites of animal research. And in our research, we've seen people talk about pressures like the funding and publication pressures you get in academic establishments, or the pressures for a fast turnaround on animal experiments you might find in more client-focused settings, so in the private sector. Other pressures seem to be more generalised across different kinds of research institutes. So we might think about things like staff shortages, or the burdens that staff faced during the recent pandemic to work longer hours to cover sick colleagues, to work away from home, or to cull larger numbers of animals because work was delayed or suspended due to COVID-19. So there's both kind of distinctive pressures in different kinds of establishments, but also shared pressures as well. The results of these pressures, though, are often very similar, with staff at all levels, from technicians to named people and researchers, having to make really, really difficult decisions and perform complex, careful and vital work while being increasingly emotionally and physically exhausted. And this really came across in some of our interviews. So here's Debbie and Fiona, again, not their real names, talking about how they've been working at the same place for 2 years and taken on more responsibility. And here they're talking about staffing. Staffing, they say, is majorly important, because all that stress is put on you and it affects you, and then you're making mistakes. We're all human, and you feel bad for it, but I was trying to concentrate on what I was doing and I wouldn't have made my mistake. And then she says how she went home and that mistake kind of stayed with her, and you're back into it the same day. And what she's articulating, I think, is what a lot of people experience about how being under pressure can kind of compromise your ability, if not to care for the animals, then maybe to care for yourself. And Bella Williams has also talked about this in more depth in her examination of cultures of care in animal research. And she says how human carers work with and interpret the needs of animals, but their ability to do this depends on also how human-human interactions play out in these contexts. Okay. And so a final set of findings thinks about how different ideas of care aren't always easily sitting alongside each other. So one of my sort of go-to examples of this is innovations in husbandry practice. So these are often undertaken to improve both staff and animal welfare in animal research facilities. But often they don't always sit easily alongside things like the fact junior animal technicians really like interacting and handling animals. So here's Claire talking about the introduction of individually ventilated cages. So going from a system where animals are kept in sort of open cages to these sort of more plastic boxes or individually ventilated cases with their own air conditioning system. And she talks about how she prefers conventional caging to IVCs, as she called them. They're basically in a box. You look at that mouse in a box and it's just doing what it would do. Whereas mice kept in a conventional box, you can kind of pull the racks out. And she talks about how when the cages were open, the mice would sort of smell her coming and she'd see them react to her. And she felt she had a relationship, that she was part of their world. And then she kind of flips back and says, but I know that IVCs are better for animal health, and I know that maybe they're better for human health. And she talks about swings and roundabouts. And I think her description here really captures how this new innovation, this individually ventilated cage, enables good care. It's better in terms of biosecurity. It might be better for the sort of health of the mice. It might be better for the health of the technicians, because there's not an exposure to things like animal allergens. So we're often told these are a health benefit. But it also takes away something. It takes away something of that human-animal connection. And that's a very important resource for a lot of the animal technologists we spoke to, because when they've had a really bad day, one of the things they like to do is spend time handling and interacting with the animals. So this is something that makes care possible, but also stops it being possible in interesting ways. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of the ways our research kind of gives insights into just how complex a culture of care can be. I think the next interesting question is, other than write academic style papers like those I referenced, what might we do with some of this research? And that's what I want to focus on for the final section of my talk. As I think is kind of evident, a culture of care is complex and multifaceted. And this means it's difficult to talk about. It also means it's difficult to teach. So increasingly regulators are sort of mandating institutions to promote a culture of care. But how do you do that in practice? And I think it can be really challenging, because it's hard to find space to talk about something that's quite emotional, quite reflexive, about values, about experiences, in a very intense and pressured working environment. And there aren't a lot of spaces. What I was also aware that when I presented my research, like I did to you now, to audiences of animal research stakeholders, like animal technologists or researchers, the thing that really connected them was the quotes. It was the stories told by people like them about their experiences in the workplace. And putting these two things together, I wondered if storytelling could offer a new approach to training, a new way of getting people to talk about and think about cultures of care. So we were lucky enough to receive some knowledge exchange funding. So this is money that's specifically about translating academic research for stakeholders. And we put together, or I put together, working with stakeholders from industry, from academia, from non-governmental organizations, this project, which was aimed at developing a new training session, which was all about the culture of care. It was about creating an open, reflexive, safe space to talk about some of the challenges of what a culture of care is and how we put it into practice. And the object of the project, or what it revolved around, was using stories. Now, importantly, these weren't lifted directly from the research, they were fictionalized. So we worked with a scriptwriter, and she basically came up with mini plays, I suppose you could call them, based on some of the experiences of our interviewees. And we used these as a resource around which we built a training workshop. So we developed this over a period of months. We reviewed current training provision and established a list of key learning outcomes. Like any training resource, not every training resource can meet every objective. So we had a list of things we were trying to achieve. And then we worked with a scriptwriter to develop, test and pilot these stories. We've now got 3 of these scripts, and we're working on more. And we've got a sort of whole workshop we built this around, which we actually ran at Guelph earlier this week. The kind of things we were trying to get at with this workshop were helping people think about the fact there are these different understandings of cultures of care at play, to think about what a positive workplace culture might be, to think about ideas of shared responsibility, how we can promote effective communication, how we can empower different people within our research facility, encourage respect across different roles within a research facility, and think about the emotional division of labour. So when in a particular sort of timescale of a project, people might be under particular pressure or called on to do really emotionally demanding aspects of work. In practice, the workshop's got a number of bits. We start out with an introduction with some ice-breaking activities. So we've been encouraging people to try and draw animals in less and less time. So one of our icebreakers is getting people to draw an animal in 30 seconds, then 20 seconds, and then 10. And my colleague, my scriptwriter, was really, really keen on this. And she explained to me how important icebreakers were in creating a kind of safe space. We then do 2 different versions of the scripts, and there's a whole series of questions for discussion. There's some reflections and then a feedback survey at the end. I just want to emphasize how key the scripts are to doing this, because I think often training activities can be quite dissemination focused. So, you work through a series of slides, you give people a PowerPoint, you might even give them a scenario. But the difference that scripts make is by reading a role, people are really encouraged to empathize and to kind of put themselves in someone else's shoes. A lot of the roles are maybe slightly caricatured, and they're done that deliberately to stimulate debate. But they also kind of get people to try and put themselves in someone else's shoes and kind of empathize with different experiences and perspectives. And we often get people to read roles that aren't their own. So in an animal research facility, we might get a care staff member to read the vet's role and a researcher to read the care staff's role. So again, it kind of builds these idea of empathy. And the idea is by the time we get to discussion, people feel relaxed enough to share their own stories and experiences and understandings of what a culture of care is. So again, each script is followed up by a series of discussion points, asking people to think about the different kinds of work involved, whether they've got any similar experiences, how they might play this scenario differently if it was happening in their workplace. And then because we've had to do all these online, thanks to COVID, we've used various online whiteboard tools to encourage people to share their reflections about the workshop. One of the key challenges for any of this kind of activity is how do we encourage people to take it away, and how do we get it to stick with them? And we've explored various things like asking people to write postcards to their future self to remind them of the kind of things the workshop sparked at the time. And we've used, as I said, tools like Jamboard or online whiteboards where people can share their immediate responses to the session. Okay, and then finally, it seems to be working so far. So when we ask people what they enjoyed about the sessions, we do seem to be able to use stories to create this sense of openness, to create a platform to talk about emotions without being too critical or too emotive. It seems to be successful in getting people to talk across different groups, to understand things from a vet's perspective or a researcher's perspective, or to think about things from a different side of the story. It can highlight key things people know already and makes them reflect maybe more deeply on them, but also maybe gives people some new insights. For example, at the bottom, someone's saying how they'll be more aware of how they empower and communicate with others. I've seen some really interesting reflections from more senior staff members about how they feel responsibility for creating a good culture of care within their unit, or a good culture of communication within their unit. And again, it seemed quite successful at getting people to see things from a different perspective. They talked about how role play in particular was really useful for doing this. Things we need to work on. I think one of the challenges we face with this is I started out this project designing something as a really small face-to-face group activity, and then I got hit by a pandemic and had to turn what was supposed to be a really convivial interactive session into something on Zoom. And I think empathy is hard enough on Zoom anyway, and when you're all wearing face masks, it's even harder. So I'm really looking forward, hopefully in the future, to try some of these things face-to-face, because I think they might work even better then. We were also pushed to develop more scripts. So I think because of where I started my research working with animal technologists, I'm a little bit technologist biased. And so now we're working to develop scripts from, for example, the perspective of early career researchers who I think face some real challenges when it comes to trying to put a culture of care into perspective. And I've got some more funding to do this, which is great. We're currently developing more scripts. We're going to try some things out face to face and maybe explore other ways we can use storytelling to promote ideas around a culture of care, maybe even in different research sectors beyond animal research. Okay, I think I've probably talked for long enough now. Hopefully that's given a sense of what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. I'd love to hear your questions. I should give a huge shout out to all my stakeholders. I'm presenting this as my research, but it wouldn't be possible without the amazing support I've received from people across the sector. So that's worth acknowledging. And Georgia asked me to share this slide with you all. I'm not sure if now's the